The security gate didn't budge. An old man in a faded bomber jacket stood quietly, his hand trembling slightly as he held out a weathered ID. The guard, barely in his 20s, glanced at the creased document and shook his head. "Sir, I'm sorry, but this pass is outdated. You're not cleared to enter." The veteran didn't argue. He simply nodded, lowered his hand, and turned away, his shoulders heavy with a dignity no one seemed to recognize. A name stitched above his heart, Colonel James Holston, a name once spoken with reverence in briefing rooms and command halls across the globe. Inside the base, just minutes away, an honor ceremony was beginning. But the man it was meant to honor had just been turned away. Then, a radio crackled. "Wait, what did you say his name was?" The young guard repeated it. Silence. And then, urgent footsteps. The base commander, a stern man not known for sentiment, burst from the main building, eyes wide. "That's not just a veteran," he said. "That's the reason this base still stands." The sun was just beginning to climb over the horizon, casting long, golden rays across the tarmac of Elmwood Air Force Base. It was a big day. Rows of freshly pressed uniforms marched across the grounds, rehearsing the flag ceremony for what was to be a special military tribute. A retired colonel was being honored, though no one seemed to remember his face, only the name printed on the invitation. Security was tight. Roads were blocked off. Guests were expected. But no one had anticipated that the man they were gathering to honor would arrive alone, on foot, in a rusted-out pickup truck with a cracked windshield and no fanfare. Colonel James Holston, now 80, stepped out of the truck with a careful ease, gripping a cane in one hand and a folded-up letter in the other. His face was worn but kind, eyes alert but tired. He paused to take in the base gates, where he had once walked with pride, leading squadrons into missions that would never be declassified. The young guard looked up and blinked. The man before him didn't match the mental image of a war hero. He looked more like someone's grandfather who'd wandered onto government property. "Sir," the guard said, trying to stay professional, "I'm going to need some ID." Holston nodded and pulled out a battered wallet. Inside was a decades-old military ID, faded, the edges peeling, but unmistakably his. Still, the scanner didn't beep. "No clearance." "I'm sorry, sir. This pass is no longer valid," the guard said, scanning the ID again. Holston's face didn't change. No anger. No frustration. Just a tired breath. "I understand, son," he said softly. "Just tell the commander I was here." The guard hesitated. "What's your name?" "James Holston." And that's when everything shifted. The name didn't ring a bell for the guard, but it did for someone inside the security booth monitoring the radio. A corporal, flipping through the guest list, froze. "Wait," he whispered. "That's the guy. That's the colonel they're dedicating the hangar to." But why didn't anyone recognize him? Because James Holston never asked for recognition, never gave interviews, never attended parades or medal ceremonies. He had always let others stand in the spotlight, pilots, engineers, commanders, while he remained in the shadows, doing the work no one talked about. Back in the early 1970s, Holston had been part of a covert operations division, running critical missions deep behind enemy lines during the Cold War. The kinds of missions where failure didn't make headlines, because they never existed to begin with. One mission in particular, classified until just a few years ago, had prevented a major airfield sabotage. Holston had personally rerouted 2 aircraft, disarmed a planted explosive, and radioed for air support while pinned down in hostile territory. His actions saved the lives of 47 airmen. But you'd never know it by looking at him. As Holston turned to leave the base, the guard finally radioed the main command. "Commander Wells, we've got someone named James Holston at the gate. Says he's here for the ceremony." There was a long pause on the other end. Then a single question. "James Holston?" "Yes, sir." "Hold him there. Do not let him leave. I'm coming personally." The base commander's boots hit the pavement hard as he sprinted from the operations building toward the front gate. Colonel Marcus Wells, a no-nonsense leader with 28 years of service, had faced live fire and commanded airstrikes. But in this moment, he was running like a cadet, urgency written across every line of his face. Guards and officers watched with confusion. It wasn't like him to react this way. But he knew something they didn't. The name James R. Halston wasn't just another retired pilot or aging veteran. To Commander Wells, that name was sacred. 24 years ago, Wells had been a fresh-faced second lieutenant stationed in a foreign conflict zone. His aircraft had been grounded in hostile territory, surrounded and outnumbered. Panic was in the air. Fuel was running low. No extraction team was expected to make it in time. Until a gravelly voice broke through the radio silence. "This is Ghost One. Sit tight. I'm coming in." Ghost One wasn't on the roster. He wasn't listed on any active mission. But a black aircraft roared in, engines screaming against the wind, skimming treetops like death itself. That aircraft was flown by Colonel James Halston. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't ask permission. He flew straight into enemy fire, dropped low enough for extraction, and shielded Wells's team with gunfire as they climbed into safety. By the time they got back to base, Halston had already disappeared, leaving nothing but a scratched flight log and a saved crew. Wells had never seen him again, only heard the name whispered in quiet corners of classified halls. The ghost pilot. The unsung hero who flew into danger when everyone else flew out. And now, he was standing outside the gates, unrecognized, uncelebrated, nearly turned away. Commander Wells finally reached the entrance, breathless. The old man was still there, sitting on the tailgate of his truck, looking out across the distant airfield. "Colonel Halston." Wells called. Halston turned, squinting against the sun. "Do I know you, son?" Wells stepped forward and saluted. "You saved my life, sir. 24 years ago. You came in when no one else would." Halston smiled faintly. "Ah, that must have been a long day." "It was. But you made sure we had a tomorrow." For a moment, silence held between them. Not awkward, but heavy with memory, with respect. Then Wells turned to the guard. "Open the gate." "Sir." "Open the gate." The barrier lifted, and Wells extended his hand. "You don't walk onto this base, Colonel. You're escorted." Halston chuckled as he accepted the hand. "You always this dramatic." "I owe you my life. Dramatic's the least I can be." As they walked in together, officers began to notice. Salutes rippled along the sidewalk. A few murmured to one another, "Who is that?" "That's the guy from the ceremony, isn't it?" "Wait, is that the Halston?" Word spread fast. They weren't just hosting a tribute today, they were hosting a legend. Inside the operations building, Wells paused with Halston before a sealed hangar. One that bore no markings, no public history, just a simple plaque that had been installed that morning. Wells nodded to the maintenance officer beside them. "Open it." The doors groaned open to reveal a decommissioned State Route 71 Blackbird. Sleek, black, and deadly. It had been mothballed for years, tucked away in this quiet corner of the base. But today, it was restored, polished, and shining with honor. Wells turned to Halston. "This aircraft flew the mission that saved my crew. We found the records last year. You were the pilot. We cross-referenced call signs, decoded the black box audio. It was you all along. We had no idea. Until now." Halston stepped forward slowly, eyes misting as he ran a hand along the body of the jet. "Haven't seen her since '83, he whispered. "She got me through some hell." "This base wouldn't exist without your actions, sir," Wells said. "You deserve more than a ceremony. You deserve the truth told." Halston shook his head. "It was never about glory, just doing the job." "But your story," Wells said, voice firm, "is the job. The soldier sacrifice. The battlefield courage. The quiet, unsung heroes who never make the cover of magazines." For the first time in years, Halston let emotion show. His voice cracked. "I lost good men. Brave ones. I came back. But they didn't." Wells placed a hand on his shoulder. Today isn't just about honoring you, Colonel. It's about honoring them, the forgotten heroes. The ones who never came home. As the sun rose higher, Halston stepped forward into the hangar, surrounded by rows of young airmen standing at attention. Not a sound, not a breath, just the solemn silence of respect. In that moment, a man who had once flown through hell without recognition finally stood in the light. Later that afternoon, the officers' hall was full. Rows of decorated airmen, cadets, and senior staff filled the room in absolute silence. At the front stood a podium, and beside it, Colonel James A. Halston, now seated with a folded cap in his lap and a quiet storm behind his eyes. Commander Wells stepped up to speak. Today, he began, we gather not only to honor a man, but to uncover the truth behind a story that was never told. A story of battlefield courage, of soldier sacrifice, a story that defines what it means to wear the uniform. He paused, then tapped a remote. The lights dimmed, and a projection lit up the wall behind him. Operation Black Echo, 1979. Wells continued, this operation was sealed for 43 years. Its details were known to only 7 people. 6 of them have passed. The 7th is sitting here with us today. All eyes turned to Halston. The footage began to roll, grainy satellite images, mission blueprints, weather charts, and audio logs. A base deep in enemy territory had been compromised. Intelligence confirmed a sabotage attempt targeting an American airfield in Europe, a plot that, if successful, would have destroyed 14 aircraft and killed over 200 personnel. The mission to prevent it? Impossible. 0 air support. No confirmed routes in or out. Intel 3 days too late. But then came a transmission, marked only by the call sign Ghost 1. The voice was calm, composed, and precise. I'll go. James Halston volunteered for a solo run. No backup, no fanfare. Flying an unmarked jet under enemy radar, he infiltrated the territory, deployed countermeasures, neutralized threats on the ground, and disarmed explosives just minutes before detonation. One misstep, and he wouldn't have come back. The room was still as the recording continued. A scratchy debrief audio played. I didn't do anything special, Halston said in 1979. Just stopped something before it could start. Let's move on. He had never accepted a medal for it. Never spoke of it again. It wasn't until Wells uncovered declassified documents last year that the name James Halston appeared again, attached to the operation that saved hundreds. The room slowly turned toward him as the projector clicked off. Halston sat still, his voice low and firm. I didn't want this story told to shine a light on me. I wanted it buried so no one else had to carry the weight. Wells stepped closer. Sir, with all due respect, this story isn't just yours. It belongs to every young airman who ever wondered whether courage still exists. It's one of the greatest military tribute stories I've ever heard. It belongs to history. One of the younger cadets raised a hand, clearly moved. Sir, what made you say yes? Why volunteer for a mission like that, alone? Halston leaned forward slightly, voice steady. Because I had friends who didn't make it home. Because I've seen what happens when good people wait for permission. And because doing the right thing, even when it's thankless, is still the right thing. The room was silent. Tears welled in the eyes of some of the older officers, men who had spent decades in uniform but had never heard a story that hit so deep. It wasn't about glory. It wasn't about awards. It was about character. Real war heroes don't ask to be remembered. But they deserve to be. As the event wrapped up, Wells took the MIC again. We'll be installing a permanent plaque in the base museum detailing Colonel Halston's service, especially Operation Black Echo. His aircraft will remain preserved as a living reminder of the courage that built this base. The applause was thunderous, not the kind that comes from excitement, but the kind born of deep, honest respect. Outside, the wind rustled the American flag as it waved high above the base. Halston stood beneath it, looking up, the weight on his shoulders lighter than it had been in years. He didn't speak much after the ceremony, just stood with the cadets, answering their quiet questions, giving them bits of wisdom they could carry long after his story faded from headlines again. Before he left, a young airman, maybe 20 years old, approached him with a trembling voice. "My grandfather served with you, sir. He always told me about the pilot who saved lives without ever asking for credit. I didn't believe the stories, until today." Halston smiled. Then maybe the stories were worth something after all. The sun had dipped low over Elmwood Air Force Base, casting long shadows across the runway as the ceremony came to a close. Most of the guests had left, the photographers had packed up, and the hangar doors were closing slowly behind the gleaming black State Route 71. But Colonel James R. Halston remained, standing silently near the flight line, his weathered hands folded behind his back, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Commander Wells approached quietly, walking beside him in silence for a while before finally speaking. "You never wanted this attention, did you?" Halston smiled faintly, his gaze still far off. "I never needed it. The men who didn't make it home, they're the ones who deserved the spotlight. I was just the one lucky enough to keep going." "But sometimes," Wells replied, "a story like yours gives people something to believe in. Especially now." Halston turned toward him, the light catching his eyes. "What matters isn't that they remember my name. What matters is that they remember what we stood for. That when the moment came, we stepped forward. Even if no one ever knew." There was something deeply sobering about those words. It wasn't just humility, it was truth. Before leaving the base, Halston took one final walk past the rows of young cadets still milling around, shaking hands, nodding politely. A few asked for photos, others simply said thank you. But it was the quiet gestures, the salutes, the respectful silence, that spoke the loudest. Later that evening, as twilight settled in, Commander Wells received a phone call. Halston had made it back to his modest home on the outskirts of town. He had declined the offer of a driver, choosing instead to make the slow journey himself. Windows rolled down, the evening breeze cutting through the heat. 3 days later, the commander received another call, this one from the veteran's daughter. Colonel James R. Halston had passed away in his sleep, peacefully, quietly, as he had lived most of his post-service life, without asking for anything in return. Wells stood in silence for a long time after the call. Then he went to his desk and opened a small box he'd been keeping locked for years. Inside was a flight pin, one that had belonged to his original unit. He hadn't worn it since the day Halston saved his life. The next morning, a black ribbon was hung at the main gate of Elmwood Air Force Base. Flags were lowered to half-mast. Every officer, from cadet to colonel, lined up shoulder to shoulder on the runway, dressed in full service uniform. No announcement had been made. No orders had been given. They simply came. A final flyover took place at 1,300 hours. One of the jets peeled off in a solo maneuver, the missing man formation. A single tear ran down Commander Wells' face as he looked to the sky. "It's not about being remembered," he whispered. "But you always will be." In the weeks that followed, something changed at Elmwood. The young cadets began asking deeper questions. Veterans were invited to speak more often. A mentorship program was started in Halston's name, pairing retired war heroes with incoming recruits, so their stories wouldn't be lost again. And in the hangar where the State Route 71 sat proudly on display, a plaque now read, "In honor of Colonel James R. Halston, the man who never asked for a salute, but earned every single one." His story had started as just another name on a guest list. But in the end, that name became a symbol, not just of battlefield courage or heroic acts, but of the quiet strength that built the foundation of the Air Force: humility, duty, and sacrifice. He was a real war hero, an unsung soldier, a forgotten veteran, remembered at last. If this story moved you, share it, so the legacy of forgotten heroes like Colonel Halston lives on in every heart that hears it.